Today's lesson is going to be centered on how China attempted to reject European and foreign influence. And so we're going to start with the Chinese rejection of Western goods. In 1793, the Chinese rejected to accept gifts brought to them by a British ambassador. The British had sent things like clocks, globes, musical instruments, and even a hot air balloon to try and impress the Chinese. This was an attempt to get China to trade with them, or at least open up to Western goods. The emperor wrote a letter stating that, hey, they had everything that they needed in China, and these things were more trivial than best. So China was remaining mostly self-sufficient at this time. Their mining, their agriculture, and their manufacturing sectors were highly productive. Some of the key figures involved in this meeting were Macartney, who was a British ambassador. It was known as the Macartney Embassy. King George III was the British king at the time, and the Chinese emperor was Qinglong. This all led into what became known as the Opium Connection. Guangzhou, a southern port, was the only port open to foreign trade. China earned more from its exports at this time than it spent on imports, so they were having a favorable balance of trade, which, according to Europeans, would be a solid thing, especially under mercantilist policies. But the British began to actually smuggle in opium in the late 1700s, and many Chinese people actually became addicted to opium, and it started a war in China known as the Opium War. It began in 1839 over the trade of opium, and the Chinese emperor actually wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, which I'll go over here in just one second. A portion of that letter states, as is in the highlighted blue here, it says, "By what do they, British merchants, use the poisonous drug to injure the Chinese people? I have heard that the smoking of opium is very strictly forbidden by your country. That is because the harm caused by opium is clearly understood. Since it is not permitted to do harm to your own country, then even less should you let it be passed on to the harm of other countries." Okay, so I think that pretty much outlines the fact that obviously the Chinese see this as problematic and they want it to end. But the British kept pushing this, and eventually we have what's known to become the Opium War. And this is where China is thoroughly defeated, and this is mostly fought at sea. Their navy was just outdated and no match for the British. They ended it with the Treaty of Nanching, which was signed in 1842, giving the British control of Hong Kong and also giving the British what are called extraterritorial rights. This made foreigners exempt from Chinese law at port cities, and they were allowed to conduct business in those cities. This led to growing internal problems. There were population problems in China. It began to significantly increase from 1790 to 1850. Crop yields started to slow, which created widespread hunger and unrest. One of the reasons for this is the production of cash crops. As we learned in chapter 27, producing cash crops replaces a lot of your land where you grew rice or other necessities that people needed to survive. And this led into what's called the Taiping Rebellion. In the late 1830s, a Chinese reformer named Hong Shui-Quan from the south began to recruit followers to reform China. The goal was to create a heavenly kingdom of China, and this was becoming known as the Taiping Rebellion. It was a name given to Hong's movement, as Taiping means a great place. In the 1850s, Hong's army grew fairly large, and he captured large areas in the southeast. But by 1864, the rebellion had fizzled out due to internal fighting with the Qing and outside attacks from the British and the French. And then we have foreign influence moving in and growing. Now, there was still some resistance to change. The Empress Sui, a dowager from China, ruled from 1862 to 1908 off and on. Now, a dowager is a widow that has inherited a title from her late husband. She supported reforms aimed at education, government, and military advancement. Other than reforms in those categories, though, she was fairly traditional in her ways. Some other nations stepped in. China came under attack from many outside nations at this time, and this forced them to grant more rights regarding business and openness. Europeans, Japan, and even the United States gained access. And what they did is they created what are called spheres of influence which are areas of economic control. And then the United States declared what's called the open door policy. Once they moved in 1899, they declared that Chinese trade was now open to all nations. So I'd like to show you what the sphere of influence were in this time span in China. This map here shows you, okay, what countries. Of course, the British are in the green. These are the areas that they control. The French are here in yellow. You've got the Japanese in this smaller purple bubble here. Russian imperialism is up here in the pink color. And then, of course, a little bit of German here, right in this area. So these are the big European countries that are getting involved in creating spheres of influence in China where they controlled the economic business. Okay, next we see, because of all of this, the Chinese people, they're upset about this, and we see an upsurge in Chinese nationalism. Growing dissension, because many Chinese resented the growing power of outsiders, and they began to push for change. In 1898, the Dowager Cixi was actually replaced by Emperor Guangxu, who came into power and enacted reforms regarding the military, education, and government systems in his own way. Many government officials were extremely unhappy right away with this, and they called for Cixi to return. Now, upon return, she acted quickly to reverse some of those unfavorable reforms and imprisoned Guangxu. Guangxu's reforms eventually had no impact at all, and the people of China were still in a state of upset. This led into what's known as the Boxer Rebellion. Due to unrest, an anti-government and anti-European group of peasants formed a secret organization. They were known as the Boxers. This became known as the Boxer Rebellion. In 1900, the peasants sought change, and they led a campaign for their reforms to overthrow the Empress Sui and also kick out foreign business. They became known as the Boxers because one of their general practices was like a calisthenics, which looked like boxing, and that's where they get their name. This rebel force actually took over Beijing until they were defeated by foreign armies, which ended the rebellion. The foreign armies were a multinational force, French, German, British, so on and so forth. You can see a quick picture here of how the Boxers would attack Christians. Over here to the right is a painting of Boxers stabbing and attacking Christian people, Chinese Christians, during this rebellion. And I wanted to share with you that the college that I attended, Oberlin College, there's a pretty prominent monument there to the Boxer Rebellion, in which 15 Oberlin College students on a mission, a Christian mission there, were killed by the Boxers during this rebellion. I put a link to the story there. You can read about the Oberlin Band, is what they're called. And here's the monument. So when I would be walking to class across from this, so on the side that would be on this side of it, on the side of this rebellion is where, or this monument, I'm sorry, is where many of the classroom buildings were located. So I would see this on a daily basis. And it wasn't until later that I started studying the Boxer Rebellion that I really understood what it meant. This rebellion, though, led to future reforms. Cixi remained and contained power, and other conservatives, they did recognize the need for reform. And in 1905, she sent officials abroad to study other government systems. And in 1906, Cixi began making reforms based on what those officials had brought back. But change came slow, and unrest continued for about 4 more decades until the end of World War I and World War II.